Okay, seniors, here we go. It's time to talk about Murder on the Orient Express. And really, over the last few chapters that we read, the fact finding begins. Hercule is going about his business, is doing what he does best, and figuring out who done it. But that's really not going to be our focus for this particular class period. For this particular class period, I want us to focus on this idea of what makes Hercule so good at what he does. And there's a couple of hints to model, I guess, what it is that he does well as a detective. And in order to understand that, we're going to actually reach outside of the book today, and I'm going to have you listen to a really interesting excerpt from a podcast. So let's get right into it. The chapters we have in front of us that we read over the weekend are the ones that describe the body, and from there we get basically the scene of the crime, what's going on there, what's happening, and then we have this interesting connection where we find out that Ratchet himself is not who he says he is, and it seems that everyone had this particular suspicion about him, but no one ever acted upon it. No one ever dug a little deeper, and it wasn't until Hercule comes across this particular clue where he starts putting the pieces together, and we find out that this person is someone who was the mastermind of a kidnapping, a pretty famous kidnapping in America, and that should actually ring pretty true and ring pretty familiar to you, because if you remember, we did speak about this idea of the kidnapping famous case, the case in which we had this Lindbergh baby who just vanished out of nowhere, ultimately was found dead, and a ransom was paid out, and someone was actually executed for it. In this particular story, we have a very similar, almost parallel example where Ratchet is the individual who put forth the ransom, who was the mastermind of it all. The child, in fact, did die or was killed, but ultimately, this particular character got away with it. They were acquitted, and they flee America, and Hercule puts two and two together and says, here's who we're dealing with. Here's who actually this person is. And all of a sudden it kind of changes. Everyone's tone about this person is, oh, he deserved it, and I would have done it myself. And it actually makes things a little more confusing for Hercule, because now so many people are saying, oh, absolutely, if I would have known that, things would have been different. Well, what if you did know? And so Hercule is going through, and we find out that we actually get through a couple of the interrogations, whether that's from Mrs. Hubbard, whether that's from, again, McQueen, or the valet of Ratchet. So there's a lot of information in here, and some of it is conflicting. Some of it doesn't match up with times, or it doesn't match up with what they heard, and then it really gets convoluted when we get to Hubbard. Mrs. Hubbard proclaims that the killer was in her room, and that, it had to be that person because she found a button, and the button was but it turns out the button was from the porter from the conductor, from the train, although where the button was found was far away from where the conductor had been. So there's a lot of stuff to sift through, and Hercule is doing his best, and what he's doing is he's keeping all that information close to his chest. What I mean by that is when he's actually going through and thinking about it and referring to it, he's not really letting too much out of the bag. He's kind of in there with his thoughts, and we don't know what's going on in there. There's a bunch of different theories. Was it two people? Was it a man and a woman? Was it a man who made it seem like it was a woman? Was it a woman who made it seem like it was a man? All this stuff we have to sift through. And Hercule so far is doing a good job of sifting through all that. But the only reason he's able to sift through all that is because of one thing. And that brings us to what we're going to look at outside of the novel. And that is something known as TDT, which is Truth Default Theory. It's actually a theory that's been researched and tested. And what it says is that we as human beings actually naturally default to belief, to finding something that we're told or hold as true to be fact. And even when there's things that, I guess, start to erode our belief away, it's not that immediately once there's a crack in the armor that we say, oh, this must not be true anymore. In fact, we're constantly rationalizing ourselves back to our original truth until there is overwhelming evidence that we actually can prove that the truth that we once held is no longer accurate. A good example that we've seen in movies and whatnot is this kind of anecdote that when a friend of yours is being cheated on, you never want to be the first person to tell them that information because the initial reaction is going to be, well, you don't know what you're talking about, stay out of your business, everything is fine. That actually is an example of TDT, of that truth default theory. What this person who's being cheated on believes is this fundamental truth that they're in this committed relationship and that this other person really cares about them. And it might not just be once, it might not be twice, it might be an accumulation of moments that eventually the person finally realizes that that truth that I did believe actually is now irrefutably untrue, that there's enough evidence that it can break it all apart. And this is where it gets interesting, because in hindsight, we can always look back and say, well, you knew that, or somebody so-and-so told you this person was cheating on you months ago and you stayed with them, or they didn't pick up your calls for 3 days. You should have known. And what the research will actually tell you is that what this person was doing is not that they were in denial, but that they were being extremely human. That in fact, TDT says that it's not just that there's a couple of instances that break the veneer of the truth you believe, but that there's just not enough evidence to refute or completely deny the truth that you hold dear. And this is where TDT is problematic for a detective. So let's put ourselves in Hercule's shoes. And ultimately what Hercule has to deal with is this idea that on face value, there's a lot of narratives that could be true. And Hercule has to be very careful not to attach himself to one, not to believe one immediately. Because what TDT says is that the minute that we come to a conclusion or a truth, we're actually going to stick with that truth, even in spite of things that break that apart, until we're absolutely convinced that the truth we believed is no longer true. So, Hercule is told initially by the conductor, just on observation, it must have been a woman because these are stabs of passion. Hercule had to make sure not to believe that because TDT would tell him he would stick with that until a bunch of evidence proved him wrong, and that would serve him no purpose. When Hubbard comes in and says, the murder was in my cabin, he was standing right there. Hercule doesn't say anything. He kind of says, yeah, sure, okay, thank you for all that information, but he can't go with that because the minute he does is the minute he puts aside all the other things that could be. Even when it seems absolutely positive that there was one man and one woman killer, that one came in and then the next one did, and it was all in the dark. It seemed reasonable, but Hercule was very careful not to commit to that. And I think we need to understand that for ourselves as we move forward. We're getting a lot of different information, a lot of information that potentially could convolute or maybe even convince us of our conclusion. What Hercule would say is the minute you believe something, TDT theory would say it's going to be really hard to think of a different theory potentially. It's going to be really hard to reestablish what might be. And so I think the better we understand TDT and reflect on our own decision making, working through all these facts that we're about to get into is going to help us when it comes time for us to sift through what may be and what might not be, or to potentially see all the possibilities. One of the, I guess, kind of counteractions to TDT would be to not accept a truth, to leave all possibilities open, at least initially. And I think that's what Hercule is doing. He's saying, I have all of these options. They all seem good, but I'm going to make sure that I don't commit to one, because the minute I do, it's going to be hard for me to pull myself away from that, because that's just human nature. So these are things to consider. A lot of information has come out, and I do want everyone to continue to fact find. What I don't want you to do is to too quickly come to a conclusion, to too quickly assume a truth that will then be hard to break from. So, moving forward, this is your job. And so what I'm asking you to do today, after you've watched this, is to listen to about 12-minute excerpt from a podcast that actually digs into this idea of TDT, where it came from, gives us some real-world examples and some of the research that's been done. Just to give you some background, the excerpt I'm giving you is from Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History. Malcolm Gladwell is a prolific writer of, the New Yorker and other periodicals, and he's written quite a few books, David and Goliath, The Tipping Point, and others. He recently came out with a new book entitled Talking to Strangers, and what he's talking about in his podcast is actually an excerpt from that book. So if you're interested in the entire podcast, rather than just this excerpt, it's season 4 of Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History, and the episode entitled The Queen of Cuba, which chronicles a intelligence officer of the United States who was actually a double agent working for Cuba, and the fact that it took many instances of questioning, suspicions, and close to 2 decades to actually finally find her out. And this connects to this idea of, here are these highly trained CIA and NSA operatives who it's their job to be able to see this stuff, but because of TDT, they kept defaulting and excusing away some of the behavior that otherwise, from the outside looking in or in hindsight, should have been extremely obvious. And so maybe this will help us understand that some of the information we're given, we can't take it as fact. In fact, we need to be skeptical, and we need to hold back on making any assumptions until we're through. So you're going to, after watching this video, listen to the podcast, and then I'm going to ask all of you to write a response on the assignments page that actually synthesizes your understanding. How have the facts in the book that we've read so far match up with some of the things you now understand about TDT? What I'm asking you to think about is, how does TDT help you access or navigate some of the information that's coming from the novel? So think about that. When we meet together on Friday, we'll kind of wrap this discussion up with the next section of reading. And by then, we'll have a little bit more clarity on what's going on with the crime, or a little bit more investigation with what's going on. So thanks for watching this. Don't forget to listen to the podcast, because you're going to need to be able to reference some of the podcast excerpts that's provided on our class page in your assignment, in your quick write for this class period. So good luck with the writing. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. If you want to meet face-to-face, we can schedule a Zoom meeting. I'd be more than happy, but remember, next class we will meet in Zoom. I'll send out the invite to the meeting space, and that's going to happen on Friday, and we'll have a half hour to quickly check in before spring break. So good luck with your exploration. I hope everyone's fact-finding. I'm going to continue to check in on the documents to make sure that you're keeping up with the reading and everyone is contributing to the fact-finding with your investigative team. So let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoy learning about TDT.